it's switching gears, but not so much. You'll see that there are some analogies with what we just heard this morning. For example, for in-memory computing, as was mentioned, for having stochastic devices that can switch, that are not either on or off, but can be in both states, and for having a really large number of states, that's astronomical number possibilities of states. So it's really going to be, you will notice many analogies. And there are two presentations planned from me. So this morning I wanted to just give an introduction. So it's not about my day-to-day work, it's really more about my passion. It's on brains and artificial neural networks. And then you will see there will be more detailed talks in the afternoon with Karl-Heinz Meyer and me following up. But for now, the idea is just to give you an introduction on what are brains, how do neurons and brains work, and how did those influence the history of computing. We already saw some really marvelous talks on the history of computers and computing. I will focus this history just on the neural network aspect. So we'll look at artificial neural networks and the history, and distinguish between the various models that have been proposed in the past and that are being used today, looking both at the models and the technologies. And as it was mentioned, there is a lot of activity working on hardware, so technology is mainly hardware development. And there are these two camps, neuromorphic computing and artificial intelligence. And sometimes people tend to mix them together. They're really different. I hope you will notice the difference. And I will highlight the different architectures that are being designed to solve different problems. But first, let's start from the neuroscience side. Just a very, very, very brief historical overview of the neuroscience. You know, we have this organ in our head, and in the past, it was thought that it was just a homogeneous, you know, squishy thing that was just a blob of liquid and structures. Only in 1839, so it's relatively recent in the history of science, if you think of physics, math, and all the others. So neuroscience is relatively recent. Only in 1839, Theodore Schwann proposed that the tissue was composed of cells, of discrete units, not just a homogeneous substrate. And in 1873, there was really a technological breakthrough. It was something that really made the whole field explode. It was Camillo Golgi developed a method to stain the nervous tissue, la reazione nera. So basically, if you look at the brain, it's just a very, very dense and compact device, which has the same problem of quantum. You need topography, you need to have units that are close to each other. That's how it optimizes, because it folds in many ways so that you can keep things together. But it's very dense. So if you just look on the microscope, you will just see this very big mess of organs, of structures. And Camillo Golgi found a way to stain only a very small subset of the neurons, just randomly, in this very dense connection of units. And this led to the ability to actually view and then draw structures that are present in the nervous system. And Santiago Cajal was the main person, and even today in all the textbooks you can find the drawings of Santiago Cajal, who was basically reporting the structure of the brain from bird brains. And there are many, many beautiful drawings of, this is one example, of how neurons are arranged and then connected among each other in brains that come from Cajal and are still being used today in textbooks. This was 1887. In fact, even though Cajal was using Golgi's technological breakthrough, it's funny to see that they really were fighting against each other. Camillo Golgi was still of the opinion that, I mean, even though he discovered this reazione nera mechanism, he was still of the opinion that it was a continuous medium, whereas Cajal was really pointing out it was really discrete components connected among each other in different ways. By the way, this computer is a clear example in which structure determines functionality. We heard about having to, in the future now we have opportunities for building dedicated computers, not general purpose. And this is a very dedicated computer in which the structure determines the functionality. You will see brains are very, very dedicated machines. They're not general purpose like a processor. In 1936, so getting close to our days, Dale and Louis were awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering the principles of synaptic transmission. You will learn how neurons communicate. They communicate through synapses. We'll see all the details. But the discovery of the details of this communication was only done in 1936. And finally, when we start to learn about how does the brain evolve and change in a way to solve problems as a computational engine, the main discovery was proposed by Donald Hebb that postulated the theory of Hebbian learning, basically saying if things are correlated, then the connection between them increases, the strength of the connection increases. If neurons fire together, they wire together, and otherwise it doesn't. And then in 52, Hodgkin and Huxley proposed their famous model for how action potentials are generated, and also got the Nobel for this discovery. So as I said, this is a very, very brief, but just to give you an idea of how things developed. And from 1952 on, we have been experiencing a Moore's law in neuroscience. If you see the type of research experiments that were done in the 50s and 60s, they were done by looking at single neurons with electrodes, either patch clamp or extracellular recordings, looking at 1, 2, 3, 4 neurons. And then technology started to help neuroscientists, allowing them to look at maybe tens of neurons. And it was on the slow part of the exponential, and then in the past 10, 20 years, multi-electrode recordings became available, so people were able to see what happens at the level of tens of neurons, then maybe hundreds, and now, just a couple of years ago, IMEC and colleagues developed the technology to measure from over 500 neurons. And now we start to be able to see what are the networks of, maybe up to 1,000 neurons. This is on the single neuron side, and just by poking invasively, putting electrodes inside the brain. Of course, there is also the other type of measurements, which is EEG and fMRI, that looks at completely different scales. It looks at millions of neurons together. So there you lose the specificity of what is going on at the single neuron level. And that also has been around, but there's never been this intermediate range where you could do tens of thousands of neurons, and only now technology is becoming ready for this. And if you look at the number of neurons being recorded over the year, you see the same exponentials that you see with Moore's law. So it's nice to see. So this organ that we have inside our head, that's the brain. As I said, it's really folded over and over. The average human brain is about 1.5 kilos. It's about 1.1 to 1.2 liters. And it's essentially 2.5 dimensional structure. If you look at the neurons themselves, they're really on a small stripe. And if you were to unfold this and lay it out flat, it would be like a pizza, where you would have all your neurons in. And inside, you have the gray matter, where it's basically all the wiring. Wiring is really crucial. And nature has evolved in a way to minimize wiring and minimize power consumption. So if now engineers are trying to develop technologies that reduce power consumption, which is the main limiting factor in technological progress, and of course minimizing area, because silicon area is money, looking at the brain is a good strategy to understand how to do that. And the way that the brain works is basically, it's a very dedicated computational structure that essentially has been developed to produce behavior. So we have many ways of receiving sensory inputs. This is an example of visual input coming in, but you have all the other senses. These inputs are encoded in different ways. The retina, which is here, this is actually, even though it's far away from the rest of the brain, it's part of the brain. And here there is an example in which neurons are really close together, and because they're close together, they can communicate using analog signals. So all of the visual processing done in the retina, or 90% of it, is done through nearest neighbor interactions with analog signals. Once you have to communicate signals across long distances to the thalamus, and then to the visual cortex, which is back here, then you need to have a reliable way of transmitting signals. And what nature has found to be a reliable way is to use pulse frequency modulation. So signals here are converted into spikes, action potentials, and the frequency of the spikes encodes the magnitude of the analog signal. So here you see a raster plot over time, different numbers of neurons, could be of the outer plexiform layer of the retina, transmitting signals to other destinations. And you can see that there is a very high frequency at the beginning and then lower frequency at the end. This is probably the onset of a stimulus. A light turned on or something appeared on the TV. And then signals then get lower and lower frequencies. This is not just noise. This is a complex way of encoding signals, and people are trying to understand, what is the optimal from the information theory way of transmitting. But these signals are transmitted across the brain. Then the visual processing happens in the visual cortex. Of course, there's dedicated areas, auditory cortex for auditory processing, somatosensory cortex. For the input side, planning happens in the front when we want to think of, what should we buy if we want to have dinner? What should I study if I want to have a good success or a high salary? All of that happens in the frontal areas. And then in the middle is where everything comes together from the sensory side and the planning sides to motor. So from distant in time, what should I do, for the future years, for tonight? Then you get to the mid part of the brain where you say, what muscles should I move to, get some water? And then you go to the motor commands. And this is the same thing here for the sensory part. From distant, you can see stars, the most distant sensory inputs. Then you get closer to what can you hear, so you get closer to meters, to somatosensory, then to the real, my body now here. So this is this convergence of distant planning and distant sensing towards motor actions coming here. And then, of course, the motor commands go to the spinal cord, which then controls your muscles and you behave. So all of this is closing the loop. And the really interesting part is that animals and humans change the environment. So it's really a closed loop interaction. And it's really important to realize that the goal of the brain is to behave. All of nature's evolution of optimizing everything that we have in our head has been done to produce optimal behavior. So without this loop, it doesn't make sense to have an isolated brain in a glass that only receives inputs and has no outputs. It wouldn't be such a magnificent computational engine. So this is actually something that many neuroscientists have realized. Why do we have a brain? And there's many biological structures in the world that are much bigger than us that don't have brains. And the reason is that they don't need to, because they don't behave, they don't have actions, they don't move. This is a main argument of David Wolpert, who is a famous neuroscientist. And a nice example of that demonstrates this hypothesis that we need the brain to behave is given by the C-squirt. By the way, interrupt me at any time if you have questions or arguments. I'm happy to. This is just an interactive discussion. And also, I was wondering how many of you are biologists? How many of you know about neurons and brains? So, okay, a very small percentage. So I hope I don't bore you, but if you do have something, it's not my real field of expertise. If you have something to add, please do feel free to add. And I don't know if you know about the C-squirt, but the C-squirt does have a nervous system when it's born. It does move, it navigates the environment until it finds a rock, a nice place where it can dock and then stay there for the rest of its life. And then just, through diffusion and just by receiving food, survive. The point of this animal is that once it does find the rock and it locks onto it, it digests its own nervous system. Having a nervous system is very expensive. And once you lock onto it and you don't need to move anymore, you should not waste energy. And that's what happens. It basically eats its brain out, and then it just stays there for the rest of the world. This is actually something that students say it's an analogy to professors when they get tenure. So what makes humans so much more intelligent than the C-squirt or other animals? Is it the fact that we have a large brain? No, that's not it, because if you look around the world, there's many other animals that have larger brains. Elephants have the largest. So you might say, okay, maybe it's the relative size, the size compared to the body mass. So is it that? No, that's not the case either. If you look at marmosets, they have the highest relative size, the highest percentage of the brain compared to the body. What really counts is the number of neurons. If you look at different rodents and primates, you see that they have more or less the same size of brains in terms of weight. For example, 18 grams for an agouti and 16 grams for an owl monkey. But they clearly have different cognitive abilities and more intelligence if you measure it in terms of cognitive abilities. And you clearly see a difference in numbers of neurons. There's 1,468 million compared to 857 million, and also in other rodents. And there's actually a very, very nice article, recent article, it's 2009, that does all these calculations and show you the human brain in numbers. And you can see we have about 86 billion neurons in our brain, and you can see the difference with all the other species. And then you can also compare with the cognitive abilities of the various animals. Primates, which is the main, the closest cousin to humans, is what is being also used in animal experiments to evaluate, both deficits and disease, but also cognitive abilities for understanding how we work and how just in general animal brains work. So brains really differ across species, but what really is remarkable and striking is that the cells that are in all these different species, going from C. elegans to worms, insects, to mammals, the cells are all the same. They all have neurons. So there must be something extremely powerful in this idea that nature found to do computation that is the neuron. And neurons are really remarkable. It's not like our blood cells that are all equal. Every neuron is different. And if you see here, these are all pictures of different types of neurons from different parts of the brain. We'll go into the details actually in a couple of slides. But it's really remarkable that the common element across all these species, from insects that do, crickets that do auditory localization, to humans that do reasoning about, soccer games and who is going to win the World Cup, it's all done by the same computational element. And these neurons can be modeled. That's what we are going to learn about in these lectures, both in software and hardware. But you can make abstractions, and you can try to understand where is the level of abstraction that is relevant for doing your computations. Of course, real neurons are the most complex things. They're really composed of complex molecular mechanisms at all scales, different time scales, different spatial scales. They have different components. It's really a marvelous computational engine, but also extremely complex to understand and to model. A very powerful way of modeling neurons is using conductances. We'll see the details of this as well. This, however, is very computationally intensive. If you're doing hardware, it requires a lot of resources, transistors. If it's a CMOS, if it's DNA computing, it will require a lot of DNA blocks. So it's just a lot of area. And if you're doing software, it's a lot of CPU time. So you're trading off time with space. Another class of models that is a bit more simple to implement is the one of integrate and fire. We'll see also those. And then the most simple one is rate-based models, where you just say the firing rate of the neuron, the number of spikes per second, is just an analog number. And I represent the activity of the neuron with this analog number. And either this analog number goes from 0 to 1 and then it saturates. It can saturate smoothly, like with an S function with a sigmoidal unit, or it does not saturate. It's just a rectified linear unit, which is actually what a lot of software algorithms are using these days if you're into machine learning and deep networks. We'll see that as well. But if we go back to the real neurons, they are extremely complex. And this is just to give you an idea. If you look at the cortical inhibitory neurons, neurons can only spike. So if you look at signal representation, it can only be positive. Firing rate, the frequency of number of spikes per second, is either 0 or a positive number. So if you want to have positive and negative number, you need to have two channels, one for the positive side, one for the negative, and then you can subtract. This negative side channel is basically given by inhibitory neurons. And inhibitory neurons, for example, in the cortex have this classical shape. They're called basket cells. They're more or less the cell bodies at the center, and they spread out their output uniformly. And then they receive also input uniformly. In all these pictures that you see, you can maybe see the cell body. That's the soma. That's where the action potential is generated. And all the time, what you see is the dendrite, which is the input part. All these structures here, these complex structures, They're all the input where you receive signals coming into the neuron. It's the dendrite, and on the dendrite you have synapses. We'll see also those. There's the dendritic tree, the soma, and then the axon. We don't see it on this plot because it would go off scale. It would just basically go to the coffee, where we have coffee, if we were to take the axon here and just plot it. So the axon is much, much longer. That's where the output goes. And the output basically is the spikes. Whenever all the inputs are integrated and they reach some threshold, the neuron generates an action potential. This is this integrate and fire. And then the action potential goes down the axon. And along the axon, there are nodes that reconstruct it because it's so long, it just the signal, this electrical signal dissipates. And so these nodes of Ranvier repeat or regenerate the action potential so that it can really go long distances. And once it reaches the end of the axon, it branches out, and then it contacts many other neurons to this destination. This is, for example, a pyramidal cell in visual cortex. That's when we process vision. This is in the cerebellum. That's where we learn to do fine motor control, and many other places. So until a few years ago, the neuron was the star of the show. How do you model it? Do you use conductances? Do you use integrate and fire? How do you connect these neurons together? How do you do these neural networks to solve problems? But recently meaning in the last 10, 20 years, it's been shown that what really is important is the synapse. The synapse is what receives the input, and this dendritic tree here shows the complexity of how you can arrange synapses. You can put them in many different places, and depending on where they are, they will implement different functions. But also, it's a complex dynamical system. It's a state-dependent complex dynamical system, and it's a classical example of in-memory computing, because the synapse stores the memory of the network, whether a network is composed of different neurons and how they're connected and how strongly they're connected. But also it implements the computation, because once you receive the action potential, so the presynaptic neuron is somewhere far away, the action potential is coming down, it will then reach the end of the axon. At the end, this action potential will open channels in this terminal, and then it will release chemicals. So we go from an electrical communication means to a chemical communication means. These chemicals diffuse in this goo that's connected between neurons, and then they will reach the postsynaptic terminal. This is a spine, and this is the postsynaptic terminal, and this is the other cell. And they will open up channels. There will be a chemical reaction. These channels that open up introduce a depolarization in the membrane, which changes the voltage, which produces a current. The current then is sent down the dendrite. And when all these currents are summed together in the soma and exceed a threshold, the neuron then makes an action. So who actually decides whether to transmit or not is the neuron. But the synapses are really complicated structures that actually have all the dynamics. And here you see an example. It's a really interesting picture, actually, that won the Science and Engineering Visualization Award. This is a real cell. And you see a really nice example, because the spine here is basically, depending on the thickness, you change the amount of current that can go through. But you see that there's another spine here that's connected, and this could be an inhibitory signal that's acting as a veto. It's like a knot. No matter what you have here, if I have a condition saying that you shouldn't pass this current through, you can block it. And if you're thinking of constraint satisfaction problems where you have ands and nots and ors, this could really be a very intelligent way of routing signals through or blocking them depending on internal states or different conditions. So you can understand now why synapses are becoming more and more interesting, because through these connections and through the dynamics, you can implement both analog signal processing and digital logic operations. We'll see many other examples of this analog and digital. And this is an example of the type of dynamics that you can have. In the most simple case, a synapse is just a first-order linear filter. If you have an impulse, you kick a synapse with a spike, you produce an output current, excitatory postsynaptic current, EPSC, which has first-order linear dynamics. Your impulse, it's biology, it's not infinitely short. It might be 1 millisecond. This is 10 millisecond timescales. So your step is a 10 millisecond pulse. once your pulse goes away, the current decreases exponentially, e to the minus t over tau. So it's really first-order dynamics. This would be a linear filter, so you can do linear operations, linear signal filtering. This is an example of a synapse that's doing nonlinear operations. So here you have the presynaptic inputs, so these are the spikes that are kicking the synapse, these pulses, these 1 millisecond pulses. They're irregular, they're actually distributed with a Poisson statistics, but every time you have a spike, you produce an excitatory postsynaptic current. And here you see it, it's the impulse response, which would, if it were only one, it would decay exponentially, just like here. But now we have multiple spikes coming in, and what you can see is that the response to the first spike is much higher than the response to the second spike. So the weight of the synapse is decreasing with every spike, and the response to the third spike is smaller than the response to the second and the first, and so on. So this is like having a nonlinear property, which is like a high-pass filter. If you stimulate the spike with the first spike, you're really sensitive to the signal that's coming in. But if you keep on stimulating it, you become less and less sensitive. It's a mechanism which we experience every day. When we turn on a projector, we initially hear the sound, and then we don't hear it anymore. If you enter a room with some smell, you initially feel the smell, you can sense it, and then you don't notice it anymore. This is due to both the synaptic operations and neuron operations. The neurons also have something similar, which is called spike frequency adaptation. If you stimulate a neuron with a constant current step, it will fire with a high rate at the beginning, and then the output will slowly decrease because it's getting habituated to this boring constant stimulus. It's a way of minimizing energy consumption. Every spike burns energy. So these are examples of dynamics that you can have at the level of the synapse, and we'll see also dynamics at the level of the neuron. And the synapse, as I said, has become really the star of the show now. And also for synapses, you can have different levels of complexity when you try to implement models. In the classical deep networks that we have in our cell phones, they're multipliers. So there is no dynamics. It's the most simple. Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. So in standard deep networks and convolutional networks, they're static multipliers. They start to add some nonlinear behavior like dropout and things, but it's really very, very basic things. If you want to model real behavior of synapses, you should really look at the molecular structure and the dynamics. But that's taking, just for one single synapse, it would take 1 night of a fast workstation to simulate how the 3D structure of the proteins change as a function of concentrations of neurotransmitters and so on. So it's even a single synapse is way too CPU intensive. So this is mainly done by drug companies that want to see the effect of different concentrations of substances and see what they have on synapses. But for neural network simulations, as I said, for these deep networks, multiplication is now the state of the art. And for spiking neural networks, which are trying to understand how the brain works by computational neuroscience simulations, maybe the level of complexities is the one that we saw before, this short-term plasticity, where you introduce some nonlinear properties on the filters, on these filters that are modeling synapses. We'll see examples of spike-based learning as well. And these synapses essentially are modeled, as I said, as a first-order linear filter, which converts a voltage depolarization into a current. What is the symbol that the simplest symbol that you can think of something that converts voltages into currents? It's a resistor or a conductance. In biology, you talk about conductances. And you can model the effect of these channels, which are both in the synapse and in the cell, as conductances or resistors that have some voltage dependence. So you have voltage-dependent conductances. And here is an example of how to model the properties of the neuron when it produces an action potential. So it's not about synapses anymore, it's about neurons, but these conductances are everywhere. They're in the synapses and the neurons. The most important ones the neuron you can also model really nicely with a simple RC circuit. If you inject a step current into a neuron which is small enough and you measure the memory potential, you will see that it rises exponentially. And if you stop injecting current, you will see that the memory potential decreases exponentially, just like an RC, simple RC. The thing is that the neuron has nonlinear properties as well. So if you keep on injecting current and if the current increases above some threshold, which could be, for example, just by the integrated synaptic inputs, the summed weight, the weighted sum of your inputs, then you will activate a positive feedback loop in which this voltage-dependent conductance opens, so it will have even more current going in, which will make the memory potential increase even more, which will open the conductance even more, and so you have runaway process, positive feedback, bang. As soon as you go above the threshold, you go to the max. You don't have overflow error here because it's a physical system. So these channels open, they have dynamics, so they know that you shouldn't be opening and burning power for long amounts of time. So these channels also close. After this has happened, they close. It's a very carefully calibrated set of dynamics in these channels with the dynamics of the neuron. And so you burn power only when you need to. So you have activation channels that activate the channel, and then inactivation channels that stop it from just pushing. When you're already to the max, you stop pushing. And then you have also negative feedback with those lower dynamics. After you go to the maximum, you have potassium channels that open up, and then you start to discharge the membrane capacitance through this negative feedback. And these are slow channels, and they last even longer than the sodium ones. And so when you're discharging, you go even below the resting potential. So the action potential, if you measure one from real cells, you'll see it will go up, and then when it discharges, it goes below the resting state because you're keeping these channels open for longer than you need. And then when these channels close, the sort of passive behavior of the neuron turns on again, and you have these exponentially rising to the resting state values again. So this is a typical shape of an action potential. The period in which you're below the resting state here, you can stimulate the neuron, you can kick it as hard as you want, it's not going to fire anymore because it's being basically actively shut down by this potassium, by this negative feedback loop. And that's called the refractory period, where you cannot shut it down. It has a really important functional relevance because if you have a refractory period, it means that you cannot have two spikes too close to each other because they have to be at least as far as the refractory period, which means that the firing rate, the frequency of spikes, cannot go up infinitely to large numbers. It will be saturated when you reach the refractory period. So this sigmoidal shape of how frequencies change with injection current is really due to the refractory period here. These are the dynamics. I told you the dynamics of these channels, how they open and they close, are really well calibrated with the whole process. And these have been measured also by Hodgkin and Huxley in '52 when they got their Nobel. And depending on how much current you inject into the neuron, you will see different step responses. And the sodium one, this the one responsible for the activation and inactivation of the positive feedback loop, is the faster one. So first you go up, you spike, and then the potassium is the slower one, which then shuts everything down again and keeps everything shut down for this refractory period. So these are the dynamics. It's how these channels open and close over time. So it's amazing if you look at the complexity of the at the molecular scale, and then you can really, all these complex mechanisms somehow cancel each other out in a way that you can model it and implement it with first order linear filters. This also behaves very much like a first order linear filter. And if you put all of these things together, you get action potentials. If you measure these action potentials, you will see different shapes. I told you that the amazing thing is that all animal species have the same type of basic building block, and if you measure, depending on the subtle differences between these building blocks, the action potentials will be relatively different. So here, this is the squid giant axon, the thing that actually, the cell that Hodgkin and Huxley were working on when they got their Nobel Prize, and you see the spike, the refractory period. This is cat visual cortex, that was this pyramidal cell that we looked at. And then, the retinal ganglion cells, these are the cells that, after all of the analog processing has been done, and you need to transmit to the thalamus and then to the cortex, these are the cells in the retina that convert analog into spike frequency. And locust, insects, so you can go really from primates to insects, and you can see that nature is using the same principles for doing computation. So this was sort of the very, very, very quick primer on brains and neurons. I'm going now to move on to the story of neural networks and computation, of scientists that were really inspired by how brains work. If you have any questions on real biology, ask now, because otherwise we're going to move on to the more artificial neural network field. Okay, so we can take questions also after. You don't have to be intimidated if you don't want to do it now. But keep this in mind, and now we move on to the artificial neural networks. It's not an abrupt change, because you will see the history of computation has been inspired by real brains from the beginning. And we'll start looking at computational models, and we'll start with something that was being proposed in 1907 by a physiologist. You know, France has a really long history of strong mathematics, and even physiologists had a really strong background in mathematics. And Lapicque was the one that observed that if you look at how real neurons behave, you can actually model this behavior with a couple of equations, actually with one equation and one condition. And he was essentially capturing this idea that neurons integrate, and then they fire. So the first integrate and fire model was proposed in 1907 by Louis Lapicque. And basically, it's just saying, you know, the current is proportional. The memory potential is the integral of the current. And whenever you reach a threshold, some threshold voltage, you reset the neuron. So here in biology, what we see is that the neuron fires and then it's reset. From the mathematic point of view, this having to fire is just an epiphenomenon. From the point of view of computation, what is important is that you reset. You go back to the resting potential as soon as you cross the threshold. We'll see that when we actually implement neurons, it's important to have this extra bit of firing, of going up and then down. But here, you basically reach the threshold. From the mathematical point of view, what is important is just that you reset, and then you integrate again, you reset, you integrate, you reset. That's basically the formula. So this was sort of a continuous time equation with a nonlinearity, a strong nonlinearity in this continuous time equation. In 1933, sort of independently, a mathematician, a biophysicist actually, from Russia, proposed an alternative model that was using coupled differential equations, in which you had two variables that were influencing each other, and this would make this neuron basically oscillate. And then it was introducing a strong nonlinearity again. In this case, it's the Heaviside function, which is saying that, you know, if the argument of this function is positive, then the output is 1, otherwise the output is 0. So you have, again, a strong nonlinearity here. But you start to see basically a more faithful model of what's going on in real cells, because you have these coupled oscillator equations that are modeling more closely the biophysics of real neurons. So this was 1933. So remember the history. Meanwhile, people were discovering that you know, there were discrete neurons, there were synapses, and now mathematicians are starting to try to understand how to model them in mathematics. No computers, no FPGAs, no dedicated hardware. 1943 is when McCulloch and Pitts got together, and they proposed their version of a neuron. Again, it's based on the idea of integrating, or in this case, summing, and then having nonlinearities. And the model they proposed is basically saying that the activation, the output of a neuron, it's either 1 or 0. It's a strong nonlinearity, digital, like with Rashevsky. But what's going on inside is a weighted sum of signals. And in this case, McCulloch and Pitts also were restricting everything to digital also from the input. So the weights were either a 0 or a 1. What's important is either you're connected or not connected. And the input signals were also logic. They were either 0 or 1. You can imagine if you have a multi-layer network in which the input to one neuron is the output of the previous neuron, so the xj, which would be the input to one neuron, is the y of a previous layer. It has to be a 0 or a 1 if you want self-consistency. So in this case, everything is self-consistent. And here you have, the first time it appears, the concept of a weighted sum. So your input signals are coming in. They get weighted by a parameter, which is just a multiplier. And then you have the sum, which is a discrete version of the integral. And then you take this nonlinear Heaviside function, and you get the output. Here I just want to make a small digression on McCulloch and Pitts. They're really remarkable scientists, and I just want to give you a short overview of what McCulloch, of who he was, where he comes from, and it comes from a very, very recent book. A few weeks ago, it was published, "The Prophet Who Foretold Our Future" by Abraham. McCulloch is a neurophysiologist. He was trained in psychiatry, and he was actually exploring cortical circuits in primates. He came from a rich family. He went to Yale, to all the sort of important universities on the East Coast. And importantly, he was about 25 years older than McCulloch and Lettvin, who were, you'll see, important figures in this framework, in this environment. How many of you have heard of Wiener? Oh, I thought more, but Wiener is really, really famous for signal processing and filtering, and is being used. The equations from Wiener are being used in everyday life. So he's really changed the world. And Wiener was the head of the electrical engineering department at MIT, and then became the president of MIT. And basically, when he saw what the neurophysiologist was doing, he said, "Come over to my electronics lab." So you see here we have an interdisciplinary mixture, and it was really Wiener, who was a signal processing mathematician guy, who saw the importance of having electrophysiologists working with electrical engineer. And we heard this morning how it's important is to have physicists working with computer scientists. Bringing these fields together, also from the point of view of neural networks, is really important. Yes? It's Wiesner, sorry. That was the president of MIT. Aha. Okay, so I was biased and I put Wiener, so it's Wiesner. Sorry for the. So yes, I have to fix that. And in fact, McCulloch was a really authoritative figure who organized seminars and like this one that we have here, and was really inspiring many people that then would propose things that will change the world, like Minsky, von Neumann, or even people that are still have a big influence on today's work, like Cohen and Arbib. So he made seminal work in neurophysiology. Basically, he laid the foundations for what Hubel and Wiesel would then propose in 1952. Who got the Nobel for their work in plasticity. So he laid the foundations for Donald Hebb to propose the Hebbian learning rule, and in neural networks with Walter Pitts. And Pitts was the other couple here, the other one. And that's even more fascinating figure if you study his biography, which I really encourage you to do. There is a nice article on the web. I put a tiny URL here because it was very, very long, but it was by Gefter in 2015, the man who tried to redeem the world with logic. So Pitts was really a genius, mathematical genius. He was obsessed with logic, and he read the Principia Mathematica of Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead at the age of 12. These 2,000 pages of densely packed equations, and how to reduce the mathematics to logic and do formal logic with mathematics. He actually found a long set of errors in these, a series of errors in these books, and wrote to Russell in Cambridge in England. Russell replied. He was so surprised by the genius of Pitts, that replied and invited him to go and do a PhD in Cambridge, England. Except that Pitts couldn't do that because he was 12. This was at the age of 12. And he was born completely different from McCulloch. He was born from a poor family, was really in a bad situation at home. So as soon as he heard that Russell was going to go give some lectures in Chicago in the States, he ran away from home at the age of 15 and started to do some day job at the University of Chicago just to listen to the lectures of Russell. That's where he met McCulloch, and McCulloch sort of took him over as a father figure. And then when McCulloch went to MIT, he invited over him to MIT. And then Pitts, at that point, also interacted with Wisner. And Wisner basically said, forget about admission protocols. You are a PhD at MIT. I'm never going to see someone as bright as you. You're just passed through without going through all the various things. Even if you don't have the age, you don't have the background, you haven't gone to school. So he became a PhD at MIT and then got the PhD from MIT because of his sort of genius. And as I said, because they were both sort of obsessed with logic and they were trying to understand how the mind could reason through logical constructs, they started working together and came up with this fundamental work on the McCulloch and Pitts neuron. And this is, first they had several papers. This one is from the How We Know Universals, the Perception of Auditory and Visual Forms. And this is a classical neurophysiology type of diagram that you can imagine was derived from Cahal's drawings. Those were already present. And it's already, as I said, laying down the foundations of how visual cortex is constructed. There was no knowledge of the neuroanatomy of visual cortex at the time. This was just speculations. But both McCulloch and Pitts were proposing different connectivity diagrams to explain auditory and visual processing in the cortex. But the seminal work that really changed the world is the one that is in this alogical calculus of the ideas immanent in nervous activity, in which they tried to convert this processing that was going on in the cortex for auditory and visual into logical constructs that would allow you to synthesize functions, to implement, solve problems. And they started doing that with basically diagrams, proposing diagrams in which, if you have two signals coming in, and then depending on the weights against these zeros and ones, you could AND these signals, or have a proposition, a logical proposition that would pass through and build a logical construct. So these diagrams actually are the precursors of all the logic diagrams with ANDs and NOTs and ORs. They didn't exist at the time. It's the first time that people are talking about circuits in terms of engineering. Everything was done with Cahal before, but in terms of signal processing and engineering, this is the first time ever that people start to draw diagrams of logic functions. So back here we are in 1943. We heard about Lapik and we heard about the Russian model. Lapik was continuous time in spiking. Rashevsky was continuous time in binary. If we actually look at the details, McCulloch and Pitts made even more simplifications and made even less computationally powerful their model, their McCulloch and Pitts neuron. But this is the one that dominated the field of neural networks from that point on. And so the question is why? Why these other models that were more powerful from the point of view of computation did not become so successful? And the main reason is that the McCulloch and Pitts were able to show this isomorphism between neural networks and logic. That was the thing that really got everybody excited. In fact, first of all, they were living in the period in which Alan Turing was sending papers from England saying, I found a way of doing these universal computations using these signals, logics. And then they showed how neurons actually could relate to that. And John von Neumann was really inspired by the work of McCulloch and Pitts. And when he made, please correct me if I'm wrong, but when he made his diagrams and descriptions of how to build computers, he was really trying to see if there were ways of finding analogies between the logic gates and the type of processing that was being done with the vacuum tubes and the type of processing that's being done in our brain. And remember, the type of hardware that was available at the time was not very much different from neurons. These vacuum tubes were not bit precise like we have now with our digital transistors. They were prone to errors, so you needed to make sure you would have error correction mechanisms, negative feedback, adaptation, plasticity, learning. All of these things that the brain sort of takes care of were also a problem at the time, and are now becoming a problem with advanced technologies because transistors now are becoming unreliable again, as we had vacuum tubes. So it's really interesting to see how the inspiration from brain computational paradigms gave birth to the computer, and how now, after the computer is reaching its sort of end of technological progress, in the roadmaps, if you look at the roadmaps of technology, they start to say again, these technologists, we should look at the brain to understand how to go forward, how to make progress with computers. So we're both at the beginning and at the end, we start from the brain, we diverged, and then we go back again now to the brain. And you'll see this afternoon how examples of architectures that are brain-inspired to do computation. Yeah, as I said, interrupt me at any time if there are questions, but basically these were really exciting times. If I could choose, if I had to go back in time, I would want to be placed in this area where Minsky and von Neumann and McCulloch and Pitts and Letvin were there. Oh, by the way, Letvin was a colleague of McCulloch and Pitts at MIT. He was the first one that started doing experiments on frogs, and there is another seminal paper that really influenced the world of neuroscience, which is called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. And they were trying to understand, signal processing. How does light is converted into signals, and how does the frog react to these signals, either to catch a fly or to escape from something trying to catch it. And what McCulloch and Pitts did also is something that actually had a negative influence on the world, because when they tried to do these diagrams by understanding also from the neurophysiology experiments on the frog, they basically said, we are concerned about logic, so we're going to be manipulating symbols. There is no dynamics. In fact, in their paper, they say, let's just assume that all of the delays that we observe in the real neuron, when you stimulate something and you see the reaction, let's just assume that those are all unity, and they're all the same. And from that point on, this idea of getting rid of time influenced also the construction of modern computers. And up to today, we are virtualizing time in computers. There's just a clock, and the symbol goes from one phase to the other when the clock cycle happens. It doesn't matter if it's going to take 1 microsecond, 1 nanosecond, or 1 millisecond. The time is not a component in the computation. And this we will see is something that allowed standard computers to become extremely powerful, but now is crippling the computation when we try to do dedicated computers, not general purpose computers. And so I will argue that time is an important component this afternoon when we look at brain-inspired ways of doing computation. So let's move on with yes, we still have some time. Let's move on with the history of neural networks. We were in 1943. It gave birth to a whole series of papers and research labs being created, and academic courses being created on McCulloch and Pitts neural networks to do logic propositions and to do inference. And all of this was being synthesized. So people would just connect these diagrams in a way that you could solve a problem that the human would find out how to do that. It would put its own intelligence in and then build a machine that could, given some inputs, produce the right output. In 1957, Frank Rosenblatt, who was a psychologist, found out a way of automating this process. Rather than putting the human intelligence in, he said, I found an algorithm that allows me to find the right set of parameters so that when I put everything together, the algorithm itself changes in a way to solve the problem. So this was sort of the first learning algorithm. And he called this algorithm a perceptron. It's basically, remember the outputs were either 0 or 1. So you have to train the perceptron to tell you whether it should be false or true. And in this algorithm, you still use the McCulloch and Pitts neurons, which is basically receiving a set of parameters, the weights and the inputs. And the algorithm is finding out how to change the weights such that your output is your desired output. So if you have a complex function and you know the output should be 1, your desired output is 1, otherwise it's 0. And this learning algorithm basically says whenever I receive an input, which is xij, look at the output and see if the output is different from the desired output, change the weight of that particular input. So the desired output is your teacher signal. You know what the output should be. You look at the output at the previous time step. Again, time is virtualized here, so it doesn't matter if it's a millisecond, an hour, or a day, but you just look at the time step. And then if you have an error, so your output is not your desired output, you change the parameters of the network such that you minimize the error. And this has been shown to converge. So if you have, for example, on a 2D, you have just 2 inputs, x1 and x2. You can then say if my input is the green one, the desired output should be 0. If the input is a red dot, the desired output should be 1. You start with a random set of weights, and then you let the learning algorithm work until it finds the weights such that whenever you get a new set of inputs, it will give them the right output. So for example, if you find the green line here, which is basically saying the slope of this xy, and you get a new data point, it will correctly classify it. It will say it's what it should be after training has finished. This is the standard way of doing binary classification perceptrons up to today. It's been used up to today. There are tweaks and changes I will show you. What you should really notice, though, is that now that you have this learning algorithm, the weights are not digital anymore. They became analog. You're changing the weights in a way that depends on some analog number, because this is the learning rate. It could be a number between 0 and 1. It could be 0.5, 0.7, 0.3. And so the weights now are some number between 0 and 1. It's not just a digital binary number, it's just an analog number. The rest is the same. You have binary inputs and binary outputs. As I said, it's still being used today. The most powerful variant of this perceptron learning rule is the support vector machines. The support vector machines are using the same principle. They were extremely popular even only 5 years ago, and they're still being used today as a standard method for optimizing problems. And what the perceptron does, as I told you, it finds the parameters such that you can find a hyperplane that can separate your true class from your false class. It doesn't find the optimal hyperplane, it just finds any hyperplane. What the support vector machines are doing, they find the optimal hyperplane that has the greatest distance from both sets of classes. So it's an improvement over the perceptron just by adding this condition that you shouldn't just stop at any random hyperplane that works. You should really find the best one, the one that's the most distant with these support vectors. And as I said, it's being used today in all sort of engineering and products everywhere. So it's really something that Rosenblatt in 1957 proposed that today we are using in our daily life. Some of you might know about Rosenblatt, that he proposed this algorithm. This is really he's a psychologist, he's a mathematical construction. But what is really fascinating to me is that Rosenblatt was actually a geek, a hacker, and he put together a refrigerator-size machine, perceptron machine, that was receiving, it's 6 racks of electronic equipment with, you can imagine just connecting the wires. You saw the wires in the supercomputers. With 20 by 20 photosensitive inputs, it's like a camera, and 512 association units, basically stepping motors that would change the value of the potentiometers, the conductance, the resistance, which represents the weight, in order to get the 8 output units. So he had basically 20 by 20 input, 8 classes, and he trained this machine, physical machine, or he connected it such that it would train itself to recognize the outputs. It's really an impressive, amazing work, showing how a psychologist was doing mathematics inspired by neuroscience and building electronics. So when we say neuromorphic is new, we're doing all these things. This was 1957. Let's move on. 1962, Bernard Widrow is a professor at Stanford. He found a variant of the perceptron learning rule that really made a difference. So he was saying, instead of looking at the desired output as a binary signal and the output of the neural network as a binary signal, let's look at what happens before we do this nonlinear Heaviside transfer function. When we have the input to the neuron before the Heaviside, everything is analog because you have your binary inputs multiplied by your analog weights, so you have an analog number. And then you could have a desired analog output without having to discretize to 0 or 1. So now you can measure your error as a distance between your desired analog output and your real analog output. And so basically it was just a small tweak, a small change in this perceptron learning rule. The learning rule is the same as the perceptron. If you remember, if we go back here, here we have the desired output and the output of the neural network, and that's the error, and it's either a 0 or a 1. And with the Widrow learning rule, the delta rule, you have the input, sort of the analog desired output, and then this is not a digital function anymore, it's the analog output of your neuron. So you compute the distance as an analog output. And this learning rule has been shown by Widrow that it converges to the least square error. It's an iterative way of doing least square error estimation. So it's an extremely powerful mechanism for minimizing or optimizing, minimizing errors and optimizing functions. So it's the stochastic gradient descent update for linear regression. And also in this case, Bernard Widrow is an electrical engineer, and he also built the Adaline, so this machine that would do the learning autonomously with electronic components. And you can see ways to measure the error, and then all the knobs that would turn through stepper motors also to change the weights of this. So again, this is what is being used today. If you think of it at a single layer, this is the basic mechanism of backpropagation. You're computing your gradient, your error. How many of you know about backpropagation? Okay. So you're computing your gradient at the last layer. So this only works for a single layer. I mean, it's the rule for one single layer. But it's extremely powerful. If you know about backprop, everything that's running on our phone now is running through backprop on any machine. And this is the foundation. And it was 1962. So this, again, it was really a very exciting period in history. All these people were getting excited about how real brains work and how electronic components could actually be made to learn autonomously. And lots of, as I said, academic courses were being created. National Foundation, the National Science Foundation was funding a lot of research, and it was becoming very competitive. Meanwhile, you should be aware that there was also the field of artificial intelligence from computer scientists doing databases and logical reasoning rules. And so there was there were also a lot of internal conflicts. Whenever there is a lot of money being thrown at research, there's also, very well, a lot of conflicts. And Minsky and Papert wrote a book arguing, look, this is not the golden rule that will solve all of the problems. If you want to do really good mathematically proven control theory and the uniqueness of solutions and things, this is not going to work. In fact, they criticized it by saying, with this famous book, Perceptrons, an Introduction to Computational Geometry, and the basic example they gave to show that it was not solving all the possible problems is this one, is the XOR problem. If you have 2 points on a plane that are the true class and 2 points on a plane that are the false class, and if they are not separable by a single hyperplane, by a single line in a 2D, the perceptron will never converge. It will not work. So this basically was saying, this is not going to work. It's not the solution to all our problems. In the paper, in their book, they actually solved this problem by saying, if you have more than one layer, then you can do it. So they did criticize it, but they also offered the solution to it. But the main point was the criticism. And this blocked research in neural networks for the next 10, 20 years. It was really a very influential paper, and everybody got disillusioned and said, okay, let's go back to our standard optimization methods, control methods for solving, how airplanes fly and chemical plants work. So it really stopped research. It was the winter of neural networks from 1970, 1980. This was in the States. It was mainly in the States. In fact, in the rest of the world, in Europe and Asia, activity went on. And there are two very important discoveries or research results that were proposed in that period by Koonen and by Fukujima. So Koonen was proposing the self-organizing maps in 1972 during this winter of neural networks in the States. Basically, it's an algorithm that says, if you give me a set of data, I have a network that will try to change its parameters in order to represent this data in the best possible way. So it doesn't require a desired output. It just looks at the data. So it's called unsupervised learning because you don't need to have a teacher. You don't need to know what the true output is. You just provide the data in, you let the algorithm run, and the network will somehow represent the data, will find its parameters in order to best represent the data. I actually will explain better the learning algorithm soon. It's just one line, so it's very simple. And the neocogniton also is something that's inspired by the visual system. And we'll see also the slide for that. But these were really two important research outputs that came during the winter of neural network that let the field make progress. So the learning algorithm that Koonen proposed for these self-organizing maps, SOM, is very simple, and it has always the same form. If you remember, you always have a weight update. The weight at the next iteration with discretized time depends on the previous weight plus some change. And the change now depends on the weight itself, not the output of the network, but the weight and the data. It's not the desired output, but the weight, the data. That's why it's unsupervised learning. And then you have, again, the neighborhood function. You can have constraints on the topology. You can say these weight changes only if you're close to the data point and not too far away. And then some learning rate, just like you had before. And you can change the learning rate over time. That's adding some extra complexity. But basically, it's a very simple learning rule that allows you to create a structure that represents the data. And it's being used every day, even today. They use a neighborhood function to preserve the topological properties, and it's typically mapping a higher dimensional input space to a lower dimensional one. So if you have a really complex set of data, you can reduce it to a 2D plot, so you can visualize it, or to a 3D, or if you have different. And principal component analysis is one example of self-organizing maps. It's also being used vastly today in all our software. And in fact, the state-of-the-art of these unsupervised learning clustering algorithms is called dbScan. If you just Google for dbScan, it can represent your data in very complex ways, even if the data is completely separated, nonlinear. For example, here you have lots of data points, and after you cluster it with the dbScan, you can assign a label to each data point that is the outcome of the learning. And so after learning, you realize that all these points belong to one class, all these other points belong to another class, and so on. And this is based on these principles of Koonen from 1972. Principal component analysis is the same. If you have a 2D picture with lots of data points, if these data points have some structure, your self-organizing map will learn the structure. You can have all these points represented by a single polynomial, so that would be the red plot, or just a single line. You reduce the dimensionality to just one line, and so one parameter, and that will represent your data in the optimal way. So these are one-dimensional sums and principal component analysis, and this is dbScan. This, as I said, was being done in Europe, and in Japan, Fukujima was proposing the neocognitron. It's another neural network that's not based on supervised learning like the delta rule, but is really inspired from how the visual system works. And it's a hierarchical, multi-layer network in which has been optimized to process visual signals. And it starts from the image, input image, and then instead of having a fully connected network in which each neuron connects to every other neuron on the second layer, each neuron on the second layer has only a small so-called receptive field. It only sees a small part of the image. And the weighted sum of these inputs depends on a kernel, which is the same for every neuron. So there's this concept of kernels and convolution. That's why it's also called a convolutional network. This was 1980, so he worked in the late 70s. He published in 1980. And this is now the basis of all the CNN networks, the convolutional neural networks that are running on our cell phones when we want to recognize cats from dogs or label pictures saying, whether it's a church or it's a banana or bus. So this is the basic idea of having multiple layers of doing convolution, and then you can merge the outputs with some nonlinearity if you want, then you do convolution again, and so on. And this is actually very similar to what's happening in the brain, even though the brain has massive recurrent connections. It can be simplified, like Hubel and Wiesel did, to a feed-forward architecture where you have multiple layers. The first layer is the retina. Then you have convergence to area 17 of... and saying I'm supposed to finish soon. You have convergence, and then you have other multiple layers that converge and do convolution. Let me quickly go on with time. Here in 1980, after the winter of neural network, people started looking at neural networks again, and David Rumelhart, Jeff Hinton, Ronald Williams proposed the backpropagation learning algorithm. Essentially, it's saying if you have more than one layer with which you can solve the XOR problem, so getting rid of the criticism of Minsky, then how do you train these multi-layer networks? Because the delta rule that Widrow proposed was only working on one layer. And the basic trick is to use the chain rule, a mathematical trick. If you want to change the parameters of the network, the weights, such that your energy function is minimized, and you have to go across multiple layers, if you use the chain rule in which these y's represent the outputs of different layers, you can backpropagate the error through these chained derivative mathematical constructs. And so I'm sure many of you know about the backpropagation. It's, again, as I said, what is being used in any neural network today, or variants of backprop that we're using on our daily life. And it was 1986. There is a debate about who was the first to introduce it. So Paul Verbos, in his PhD thesis, talked about the chain rule, but the actual term backpropagation was proposed by Jeff Hinton, who is getting, I don't know how many citations an hour because of everybody's using this algorithm. Another model that made a huge impact in the neuroscience community is the one that was proposed by a physicist. In this case, again, it's not a supervised learning rule where you know what the output should be. It's more like a physical system that, just by the physics of the way the system is constructed, is minimizing these energy functions. So he proposed to create a neural network in which you would connect every output to every input with massive recurrence. And then he found a way, a prescription, of setting the parameters of these connections in a way that if you define the energy function as something that depends on the parameters in this way, it would minimize the energy, the dynamics of the system would minimize the energy function. So again, it's an algorithm, it's a prescription for changing the parameters in a way that you minimize the energy function, the energy landscape of this network. And this is an example of showing, if these activities here are in some, they are high and low and high and low. You could represent all the summed activity states with some energy function, which is showing here. And then if you change the weights, the activity changes, and so the energy changes. At some point, the weights will stop changing, and you will see that the activity is in this minimum. If you have this is a single one-dimensional network. You could think of connecting things on a 2D. So if you have a complex two-dimensional network, you could have multiple of these areas where you have local minima. So this energy landscape could have multiple local minima. And depending on your inputs, you could provide an input here. Depending on what your input is, you could let the dynamics evolve such that you end up in one local minimum or in another. These local minima are called attractors, because depending on your input, you could fall down to one or the other attractors. And then you could impress this basically energy landscape into the network by just setting the weights in the right way. For example, if you train the network to recognize this pattern, you set the weights such that this pattern is a local minimum. Whenever you provide an input which is slightly different from the minimum, if you don't provide exactly this input, but you go away from it, for example, by having it partially occluded or with noise, you let the network evolve, and then it will give you as output the attractor, the class. So this is called attractor networks, and actually now they're called Hopfield networks because John Hopfield was the one that proposed them, and they're so famous that they took his name, Hopfield networks. He proposed how to do this with electronics. He was a physicist, he was looking at spin glass, he proposed how to do it with amplifiers. That got the whole electronics industry excited again. There was a whole series of neurocomputers in the 80s that was proposed. So lots of companies started building analog neural network chips to solve optimization problems. And you see Siemens, Adaptive Solutions, IBM, Philips, Intel, many others, Hitachi, NEC. All of these companies, the division doing these analog chips failed. They closed. The people were moved to other divisions. The main reason here is that if you see the year, it was 80s. This was when Intel was in this steep part of Moore's law. Every 18 months, a new processor would come out, which was twice as fast as the old processor. So here, what people would do is say, OK, there's a complex problem. Computers are too slow to solve it. We'll do a dedicated analog chip to solve this complex problem using neural networks. We'll make a product, we'll become successful. By the time the chip was fabricated, integrated, and the software was designed, it was already maybe 2 years after. And by that time, the newest generation of Intel processors could solve the problem much better than the analog chips. So they were chasing basically what they call the Intel steamroller. And it was really a bad time to try to do these things because technology was just improving continuously. So we have to try to learn from history when we think about doing analog hardware now, because it's already happened, and history repeats itself. Hopefully the errors won't repeat themselves. We'll talk about this in the afternoon. And now let me just finish with the neuromorphic engineering part, which was also in the 90s, late 80s, first 90s. It mainly started at Caltech, where Max Delbruck, who's got the Nobel for inventing molecular biology, basically, was basically next office to Carver Mead, who was one of the founders of the electronics industry, and got together with Paul Mueller to discuss about biology, proteins, and transistors. Again, this interdisciplinary atmosphere. And Max Delbruck said, hey, Carver, I know you're working with these transistors. They have channels. You talk about diffusion. We're trying to understand how proteins work in membranes. At the time, it was not clear that you have these complex structures in the bilipid layer that would open up and close. It was when it was discovered that you have these. We saw really nice videos of proteins in bilipid layers. They were trying to figure out how that worked, and then Carver was doing it with transistors, and so they got together and started looking at biology and electronics. And in fact, Carver got so excited that as soon as he had the opportunity, he recruited a biologist, Misha Mahowald, to work on these channels, on proteic channels. And Misha was interested in the brain, so she looked at channels in neurons. And through their work, they really started the whole field of neuromorphic engineering, of building electronic circuits that would reproduce the physics of cellular channels, and in particular of neurons and synapses. And Misha was also a genius. She, before getting her PhD, she got the cover of Scientific American. Shortly after, she got the cover of Nature. She was invited to the White House to receive, I don't remember what medal. There were TV shows made for her. It was really an impressive amount of work that was being done, and really genius discoveries that were being made in those years. And these years are the years in which also Dick Feynman was there, it was mentioned this morning, and John Hopfield, and together they started this class called Physics of Computation. If we want to do, future of computing technologies that really squeeze the most energy out of any physical medium, we need to understand the physics of computation, whether it's DNA computing, chemical computing, CMOS. We really need to understand what is it that we want to do. So if we need to emulate the brain, we need to understand the brain, and then see what technology is available such that we can use the same physics. And I will show you this afternoon how we try to do that with CMOS. But this was really a course that influenced many, many of my colleagues, myself, and got a lot of people working on DNA computing. Eric Winfrey was mentioned. He was at Caltech at that time. I was there. People at Stanford now, at MIT, in the rest of Europe, were all influenced by this course and are now doing different future of computing type crazy ideas. And I only have 5 more minutes. I just want to mention, I told you about Misha's amazing work. The silicon neuron is one example. We'll see this afternoon examples of silicon neurons, how to use CMOS to reproduce biology. And this was done together with Rodney Douglas, who was also a neurophysiologist, together with a biologist, both turned electrical engineers, while they were at Oxford. And Rodney and Misha basically were the founders of the Institute of Neuroinformatics in Zurich, where we are carrying on this tradition of neuromorphic engineering. And just this last slide here of neuromorphic engineering. So we'll see this afternoon examples of chips that implement these silicon neurons. I'll show you basic concepts of how to do this. But now if you Google neuromorphic engineering, there is a lot of media press. There's many other groups in the world that are calling their work neuromorphic, because the basic idea is anything that's related to neurons and synapses and hardware is neuromorphic. The origins come from Caltech and this idea of physics of computation, but now the term has morphed into a more generic type. So you will see examples of GPUs doing neuromorphic computation, ARM processors, so dedicated digital processors. We will see from Karl-Heinz Meyer this afternoon above threshold circuits doing neuromorphic, digital circuits from IBM and Intel doing neuromorphic. And then I will also show you examples of the things we do in Zurich that, as I said, carry on this tradition from Misha and Carver at Caltech. Let me skip quickly through these. This was just details of that. And just to say, neuromorphic technology is completely different from the technology that is being used today in our cell phones to do deep networks. These are called accelerators for accelerating with dedicated hardware the type of machine learning and artificial neural networks that are being used to do convolutional networks and deep networks. It's a different type of technology, and so the neuromorphic circuits are not supposed to replace or compete with this technology. This is the TensorFlow processing unit made from Google, the second one, if you know what I'm talking about. It's really it's like comparing apples with oranges. It's two different things. They're both exciting. I just want to make it clear that they're not trying to do the same thing. They're really different. And with these accelerators, you can do the standard things, you know, like AlphaGo. How many of you have heard of AlphaGo beating the, what was it? Yeah. So how many of you? Okay, only I would say about half. So Google is very famous for paying DeepMind, which is a company that's doing all this advanced artificial intelligence research. And they have impressive results, both for speech recognition, for reasoning. Watson at IBM is doing very similar things. And if you just use your cell phone now to label images, you will really get impressive results from these accelerators. You can see whether there are people in a crowd. This is all done automatically, just by looking at images. But you see there are still some problems. For example, here, this is believed to be a cat, because it's just basically doing search on pixels and training the pixels using the pixels to train the image. It's not using any concept of context, you know, things that we as humans do when we reason through the picture. So there is a lot of space for improvement, also using the neuromorphic technology to complement, as I said, not replace the standard accelerator technology that is being done. So let me leave just a few minutes for questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Giacomo, for the wonderful talk. So, questions on the audience? Okay.
Well, regarding Wiener, I think that you mixed the two people.
Yes, I did. It
Norbert
was
Wiener, that he worked with Pitts, and also Jerome Wisner, that was.
Okay, so they both work with.
Exactly.
With
and
Pitts.
at some point, I went to Wikipedia for. And there is some kind of interesting story between them. Okay, so it's a nice read.
Yes, that's the article I said. Unfortunately, Pitts became depressed and started drinking, and because of this interesting story.
Exactly, because the wife of Wiener didn't like him, so they had to
I encourage you to read it. It's really fascinating how this genius went from being in the homeless to stardom, and then again became depressed and died. But it was really amazing times. Yes?
I have a question. How is it possible that a single book by Minsky could have caused such a disruption in the field?
Well, you know, I've been working in research for many years now, and there are these very big egos, especially in neuroscience, but also in computer science, which can be very influential. And so a single person, just by having its network of connections, both at the level of researchers and funding agencies, project officers, can have a big influence. So there are examples in which, as I said, for example, even Pitts and McCulloch themselves somehow hindered the development of analog computers because they said, let's just get time out of the question. Let's discretize and get time. So all of the analog computing domain was also somehow delayed because of this proposition by Pitts and McCulloch. Hubel and Wiesel in neuroscience, they proposed, we found out how the visual system works. We are measuring, we put some oriented bars in front of a cat, we measure the response, here is the structure, here is the circuit. And they proposed a feed-forward circuit in 1952. Until 10 years ago, everybody was arguing that this is the way it works, whereas if you look at the anatomy, it's massive feedback. Only 2% of the connections are feed-forward. Everything, 98% of the connections are recurrent and feedback. There's lots of nonlinear dynamics going on. But Hubel and Wiesel, for 20, 30 years, influenced all the other researchers, pushing them in this feed-forward direction. And the artificial intelligence, this neocognitron, this convolutional neural networks. Even today, when we try to label images, we're using this idea that was somehow not exactly representing reality because they didn't have the anatomic data that we now have. So there can be small seeds that can have a huge influence in the research community and in the development of research, and for 20, 30 years. So that Minsky was an example.
Indeed, the big egos are detrimental for good science, actually, in my personal opinion. And so I fully agree. I have a different question, or a related question. So Intel also has recently launched like a neuromorphic processor. As I mentioned this morning, we're also working, let's say, on a neural network decoder, so a quantum error decoder. Yeah, but actually, I don't think that's the one, because I went to Jim Helt, my point of contact at Intel, and I said, actually, we want to go for, let's say, an implementation of this neural network on the neuromorphic. And he says, no, that's not possible. So, and I did not go into, or did not ask a lot of questions, but do you know why that would not be possible? Because it's clearly like, it's not like feeding the thing a set of parameters and kind of a digital version of the neural network and then it would go. He says, no, it is actually really brain inspired. So I don't really know what he meant with that.
Yeah, so Intel has different divisions and exploring things in parallel. So they bought Nirvana, which is a deep network company, and it's as deep networks, they also call themselves neuromorphic, and it's using these accelerators like Google. And then they have a division within Intel of 12 people. Mike Davies is the head of this division, who designed a 14 nanometer chip. They announced it 5 months ago, or at CES, at Vegas. And then now they're proposing it. In fact, in this very moment, they are promoting it and showing it at the Telluride Neuromorphic Engineering Conference. And this is it's a really brain-inspired, it's fully digital, it's not analog, but it's a brain-inspired network of neurons that you can configure. And it's not using standard deep network and convolutional network algorithms. It's really more close to what real brains do. So it's very hard to map a standard machine learning algorithm onto this chip. It wasn't designed for that. So I agree with the assessment. This is more for exploring computational neuroscience and spiking neural network models. It's been designed for spiking neural networks. Spike-based neural network processing. So it's not, maybe Nirvana, the Nirvana hardware, which has also been recently announced, is better suited. And Intel has it, so you have access to that.
One last question.
So we've been talking a lot about taking inspiration from biology and taking it into computation. And some people argue, and you have people like Andrew Ng, that the brain has served as an inspiration, but only a very superficial one. And so I was wondering what your comment is on what is missing from this analogy. So we were talking a lot about synapses and this topology of neurons, but I don't think we're accounting for the internal mechanisms inside of the cells, microbiology. Cells are super complex and they do just many complex things. So what things are missing from this analogy, and what is the gap in knowledge from what we know how the brain works and we're trying to map into computation, and what we don't know, and what are the advances in that area?
Okay, so there's two things. What's missing and what's the gap in knowledge? The missing part really depends on the application. If you're trying to do a general purpose CNN or DNN chip, then the NVIDIA is the way to go. Either NVIDIA, Intel, one of these, TensorFlow is the way to go. But it's really a general purpose programmable device, maybe a little bit less general purpose than a CPU, but still with a lot of flexibility. It's completely different from the way the brain works. Even though you have this concept of neurons and synapses and weights. And the part that is really missing is the dynamic. Temporal dynamics is one. Time, that represents itself is out of the equations here. And that's you'll see it's going to be an important part in these neuromorphic spiking neural network chips. So if you want to do a dedicated application, like an IoT, something that you could imagine a bee does or a cricket, then you should really copy, for that specific task, you should really copy the dedicated both hardware and wetware, so the computational substrate, to the best. Because the crickets, if they want to do phonotaxis, they're the best in the world. And if you want to do it with the lowest power, smallest compact size, you should just copy that. If you want to have a device that can do that and something else and something else and something else, then you have to pay with power. You have to pay the price. There isn't a free lunch. And that's what you pay here. Here, this is 30 watts, and the cricket is doing it with microwatts. So you have factors of millions of difference in power consumption. Power and area. So a cricket brain is 0.1% of that.
Okay, so let's thank Giacomo again.